Dawn collected in the hollows of Winterfell like a breath held and not yet loosed. The stone was always warm in that keep, a quiet marvel of the earth. Steam threaded vents in the foundations, drifted as a pale veil across the courtyards, and rose from the cisterns to temper the bite of northern wind. On mornings like this, when the air outside the walls was so brittle it could have shattered, the warmth within was a kind of mercy. Catelyn walked the circumference of the inner yard as she did when sleep refused her. She had wrapped herself in a cloak of thick wool, the fur of it soft and smelling faintly of smoke and lanolin. In the diffused light before sunrise, the stones looked almost blue. She felt them underfoot, a sensible clemency through the soles of her boots, and paused to breathe the steam mingling with the cold air at the gate. The Raven Tower was quiet. Even birds were not yet about their business. From the kitchens came a low clatter, a murmuring of voices as early fires took. She found comfort in the sounds of Winterfell waking. The sleepy cough of a groom, the iron ring of a smith's first strikes, the yawn of a gatehouse guard who thought no one heard. When darkness had been thickest, she had knelt before the small altar in her chamber and whispered the prayers she knew best, the ones taught to her by a river she had not seen in years. Then she had risen, wrapped her cloak, and come out to the stones because it quieted the racing of her mind to count the arches and balustrades, to feel the subtle heat that made the castle breathe as if it had lungs of old granite. It was still almost winter. The trees in the Godswood had shed their leaves long since, and the heart tree there bore its pale face like something carved out of snow and stained by old memory. Steam rose in languid whirls from the pool where the springs came up, and even in deep cold a thin scum of ice could not form. She often thought of the Godswood as an old thought that the land continued to think, long after the mouths that first prayed there had closed. Today the air carried another scent. She could not name it yet, only that it was unfamiliar and made her recall, without willing it, a time years ago when Ned had ridden south and returned with a babe and a promise locked behind his eyes. Stranger's breath, that was what the small folk called such a smell, something that turned the head as if to say, "Look." She did not have to wait long to know why. The messenger had arrived late the previous day, a man from White Harbor with salt on his boots and the look of someone who had chosen to ignore sleep until he had delivered what he carried. Lord Wyman's seal hung broken on the wax by the time Ned finished reading the letter, the vellum creasing under his hands. Catelyn had watched a muscle jump along his jaw as his mouth made a neutral line she knew very well. He had said little, only that a party of guests approached under escort, fishermen from the Manderley docks, 2 Bear Island women as guides, and a Lysine widow with unusual baggage, and that hospitality was to be extended. He had not said the other part aloud, that the world liked to change its mind about what it had already decided. Catelyn saw the column come through the mist as the gate winch creaked its groaning arc. 2 women rode at the front on shaggy brown ponies, their cloaks trimmed in bear fur and their shoulders set as if braced against the thought of laughter. A string of carts behind them rattled, and a few men with the wary posture of dockhands or smugglers walked alongside. The widow, if widow she was, rode in the second rank, her head lowered and cloaked, though the hood did not hide the hair that peeked from it like a spill of pale moonlight. The hair alone was enough to make the sentries straighten, as if a wind had lifted over the parapets. Catelyn lifted a hand without thinking. Her breath made a little vapor cloud when she spoke to the guard captain, and she heard her own voice as if it came from another person, calm, measured, as she directed that they be brought to the inner yard, that kitchen fires be doubled, that Maester Lewin be woken if he was not already about. These were the right things. She moved to the yard, where stable boys hurried forward, and a groom muttered to his favorite mare that the strangers were shielded by guests right now, so no matter if they smelled like salt and uncut coin. The woman dismounted with careful economy. She was not tall. The hood fell back and the hair was indeed pale as legend. Beneath the hood her face had the cleanness of someone who had been cold for a long time and would not admit it. Not beautiful in the way the songs like to pretend. Something quieter and more enduring than that. She wore a wool dress suited to the journey, dyed the soft gray of fog. A man helped her from the horse. He had the look of an older knight trying to stand out of the way while remaining close. His beard had gone thick with the road, and his eyes took in Winterfell with its steam and its cold with a sort of relief that was at odds with caution. Catelyn knew his name was Jorah Mormont before he had removed his glove. He had served in the South once and disgraced himself, and that was a story she had heard only in pieces, the way news came north when it was tired. He bowed to her with. His voice, when he spoke, sounded like a road might sound if a man tried to say it aloud. Gravel and mileage. "My Lady Stark," he said, and spread his hands as if to show that he came without weapons in them. "Jorah, formerly of Bear Island. This is..." The woman had stepped to the side as if deflecting being pointed at. That alone was interesting. A widow from across the narrow sea. "We seek shelter." The winds were unkind. "The winds are rarely kind," Catelyn said. The woman's gaze flickered up and met hers. In it Catelyn saw an old grief being bidden to decorum. "You have found warm floors and bread here. That is what Winterfell offers. I see you have carts that will need a dry place." Jorah nodded. His eyes moved to the two big chests strapped into the second cart. The ones with iron bands knotted like belts over their bodies. The chests did not rattle like ordinary cargo. The men leading that cart had the careful pace of those escorting a sleeping child. Though there were no cries nor flailing limbs, only the weight of something that mattered. Beyond the exchange of formalities, other eyes were watching. Arya sat on the edge of a barrel as if it were a horse, her legs straddling, her elbows on her knees. The steam made her hair damp, and the first strands had started to curl around her face. Sansa stood beside Septa Mordain, who had the posture of a needle stuck upright in bread. Sansa's hands were clasped modestly in front of her, but her eyes were bigger than modesty should allow, avid and bright. Bran stood under the arch with his hand on the stone, the way he did when he watched something he wanted to climb. Rickon peered out from behind a pillar and knew only that something different had happened because everyone's voices were pitched in a different key. The direwolves had found the strangers first. Grey Wind, restless as a young blade, had circled the carts while men were still lowering the drawbridge. Summer and Shaggy Dog had emerged from the Godswood to taste the air and stare. Lady, courteous even in curiosity, had stood near Sansa, ears forward, alert but quiet. Ghost, as white as a morning without birds, had appeared soundless at Jon's side when Jon came striding across the yard to see what the fuss was. The wolves watched the hooded woman and lifted their noses, sniffed, and stilled in a way that made everyone stand up straighter without knowing why. The woman's eyes found Ghost. If she was afraid, she did not show it. She waited, as one waits before setting a hand on a skittish horse, and then she crouched, drawing up the hem of her gray dress so it would not drag in the damp. She lifted a hand. Ghost, disinclined to take compliments from anyone but his own, lowered his head and breathed in the scent of her fingers as if reading a word printed there. The woman spoke a word too, soft. Not the common tongue, but something with smooth vowels that slid like a boat into a narrow channel. Ghost's ears shifted. The white wolf touched his nose to her knuckles, almost delicate, and then he pulled back and sneezed, as if to absolve himself from the intimacy. He sat down. September hissed that they were wolves, not lapdogs. Sansa watched and memorized the way the woman moved her hand. Arya memorized the way she did not flinch. Ned arrived then, with Robb at his shoulder. He had his cloak on, but had not put the pin through it yet. It hung across his body as he walked fast. His hair was damp from the steam inside and had cooled in the air to make curling strands like blackened reeds. His face did the thing it always did when the world put a choice before him like a coin. He looked at it from both sides at once. They said the words that made guests and hosts into meanings more than they were. Bread broke and salt scattered. When they were within and the yard began to resume the rhythm of morning work punctuated by glances, Catelyn saw the chests rolled away toward a dry storeroom near the east wall, with men warned back from their meddling with a glance from Jorah that suggested he had more than one sword on him even if he wore none. The Bear Island women were led away to be warmed and fed, and to be given expressions of suspicion by the kitchen women that were only partly feigned. The widow was given a chamber halfway up the guest tower, one of the rooms with a little window that looked across to the Godswood and down to the yard. It had a hearth already lit, and a basin with steam curling from it, and a bed with a coverlet that had been patched so neatly that the patches themselves had become ornament. When she was shown to the chamber, The woman paused at the doorway and looked at the hearth as if it were a storyteller she had known in childhood. Yora stood behind her, uneasy but trying to be invisible to her gaze. "Thank you," the woman said to the serving girl who had carried her satchel. Her voice was low, careful in the common tongue. "You have been kind." The girl ducked her head, smiled in the way of girls who did not often receive thanks except when ale had been drunk, and blushed at the hair and the eyes and the strangeness of it all. She put the satchel on the bed and went back to speak of it in the kitchen, where all news ended up sooner or later. The woman closed the door and turned her back to it and let out a breath. She took the pins from her hood and combed her hair with her fingers. It fell to her waist, a river freezing on its way to sea. The care she took with it made Yora think of the way a mother might handle a child. He drifted to the hearth and warmed his hands. When she glanced at him, he straightened. "They have eyes," he said, meaning the wolves but not finding the word easily, because what had just now occurred in the yard had made him feel both older and as if he had stumbled into a story told by a fire in a place where men wanted to frighten boys into sleeping with their eyes closed. "Winterfell breeds them gentle to their own." She nodded. Her eyes had the light of someone who had been traveling with an image of a place in her mind and had now found a second image that did not quite overlap. "My lady," he added, and the title sounded borrowed and ill-fitting in his mouth. "Rest. I'll see to our—" He hesitated. "Our cargo." She watched him look anywhere but at her hands. "Our children," she said, in the quiet voice of someone who will speak truth without knowing how it will be received. "You've said as much on the road, Ser Yora, when you thought I slept." He bowed his head, not in denial. "I am a man who has learned to keep my counsel when walls have ears. The wall here is stone we can trust, mayhap, but too many years in markets that gossip." She moved to the window and pushed it open a hand's width. The air that slid in tasted like iron and water. From here, she could see the tops of the godswood trees, and beyond them, the faint line of the world where it met sky. The pool steamed and smoked. Ravens slept with heads tucked beneath each wing along the rookery's eaves. A stable boy ran, slipped on a slick patch, and bounced up again, embarrassed for no one but himself. "My brother told me of castles," she said without looking back, "but I did not think one would ever feel warm." Yora looked at her hair and saw ashes caught in it in his memory, turning it gray a day too early. She did not seem as young as she had 2 months ago. Grief had a way of aging and then, if it did not kill, it refined. He had known men who had done both under lesser burdens. "We are here," he said. The words felt thin. He had wanted to add, "and it will be all right," but he had come too far to confuse wishes with oaths. The Stark is a just man. The North is not fond of kings, but they obey fairness and keep their word. This place will not be unkind. She smiled at the window, a smile that bent fir needles under fresh snow. "There are stories about this place," she said. "Stories older than my life. Men here tell stories to keep their fingers moving when it's cold," Yora said. "It's a practical land." She closed the window, the slice of cold disappearing. "Practical," she echoed. "We will see what that means." He left her then, and the door shut on a sound no louder than a hand brushed over skin. Maester Luwin met Ned in his solar. He brought a steaming cup that did not try to be anything but hot and put it in Ned's hand. The maester's chain lay neat against his chest. The links glinted like thought-catching light. He had already been to the storeroom to see the chests, because Luwin rarely waited for permission to satisfy curiosity when it could be dressed as duty. "They are not ordinary," he said without prelude. "But then neither is this business. Iron bands, the joinery cleverer than most carpenters attempt. I could say smuggler's caution, but the wood. Have you ever seen timber that color, my lord? Not from around here. There is a smell when one leans close. I should like to call it spice and be done, but it is not spice." Ned ran his thumb around the rim of the cup and did not drink. The warmth of it soaked into him. He had not slept enough. The letter from White Harbor lay on the desk, folded now, and beside it, the second letter that had been sewn into the hem of the first, finer and smelling faintly of something sweetened, Eastern perfume. Illyrio Mopatus, the seal had proclaimed in fine letters, if seals could boast. A courteous missive that said little and everything at once. A noble widow was making a journey, burdensome property in her care, honor to the house that sheltered her, inconsequence to any who might pry. Varys's name was nowhere on the page, which did not comfort Ned. Absence was sometimes a louder sign than presence. She is what she appears? Luwin asked, and behind the question was another. Was she what the letter did not say? Ned rubbed his brow the way he did when a headache gathered like a cloud. She is a guest, he said, and that was the answer he could give without lying to himself. I looked at her and thought of a long time ago. Luwin lowered himself into the chair with the ease of a man who knows exactly where his joints will object. He tempered his curiosity into carefulness. She has hair that would draw notice anywhere pole arms and stew draw men, and the wolves approve. If we knew nothing else of her, that would be enough to put us on our best behavior.
Ned smiled faintly.
Ghost sneezed on her, an endorsement in its way. They did not speak the name they were not supposed to have in their mouths. Not Targaryen, not dragon, not the word that had left scars on men and made kings of others. Ned did not need to say aloud that he had seen a blue flower blame him for his promises. Luwin did not need to tell him that the weight of the world is not lighter for being shared. When Ned crossed the yard later, the day had fully started, that curious northern brightness that felt paler than noon in the south but more honest. Jon was in the yard with Robb, practiced swords blunted and hands reddened from the cold. Their breaths came in puffs. The boys had not yet had the aggression trained out of them. Their blows lacked the calculation of men and were far more dangerous because of it. Theon was there too, a grin like a knife cut in a new leather purse. He clapped mockingly when someone's blow landed and rolled his shoulders like a man with no weight in the world. The dire wolves sat at the edge of it all, enthroned on their own sense of belonging. When the woman entered the yard with Yora shadowing, voices thinned, or maybe Ned's attention shifted so that the other talk felt diminished. She wore a different dress now, soft gray replaced by a brown that pulled warm from the morning light. She had bound her hair into a single long braid. No ring gleamed on her hand. She walked not like a lady in fear of stones, but like someone who had made friends with mountains underfoot. She put her hand on the top of one of the iron-bound chests, as if confirming an animal was still breathing within. "Lady," Ned said as he crossed to her. He refused the itch that wanted him to look over his shoulder to see whose expressions needed reading. "Winterfell is yours while you are under our roof. If there is anything—" Her mouth shifted, as if the words rose to her and then swam apart. "You have already given more than some who called themselves friends ever did." He inclined his head, discomfort and softened at once. "We owe courtesy to those who have not offended us." She considered him a moment, and what lay between that consi. Duration and a smile was too complex to map. "Your wolves are beautiful. They are my children's," he said, glancing toward them. "Then they are yours," she answered quietly, as if she knew something about what a man could call his without saying so. The chest between them was colder than the air around it. Ned found his hand pressed to it without choosing to do so. He had expected an ordinary chill of metal, but what came through the iron startled him. Not cold like winter, cold like stone that remembers fire too clearly and has recoiled. He looked at her over his knuckles. "Old things," she said, as if answering a question he had not asked. "Older than I am, perhaps older than your stories. My brother sold them for a promise. I bought them back with a life." She stopped, and he saw her discard the rest of that sentence. "We brought them to a place that breathes warmth out of the ground because I thought." He waited, not pressing. It was too soon for the questions that would smooth what lay between them into something comprehensible. "I thought they might prefer it," she finished, and he heard the tenderness in it and the risk she had taken in allowing it to show. Maester Luwin inspected the chests with the eye of a man whose preferred weapons were questions. The hinges were cunning, set into the wood in ways that made them part of it rather than adornment. When one of the lids lifted under the pressure of Yora's hands and Ned saw what lay within, He understood something he had not wanted to name. They were the size of a large man's forearm and longer. If eggs they were eggs for a world that was not humbled. Each was a different color and sheen, the surface like stone that had been melted and then cooled very quickly, a million small scales set in unique patterns. One whose skin was the black of glossy coal veined with red like the threads a blacksmith sees when iron is nearly perfect. Another green with a patina like bronze forgotten in a chest and then rubbed awake. Another the honey cream of old ivory with threads of gold. The smell Luwin had tried to describe was not from the wood. It came from these. Not spice, not rot, an honesty like wet slate after a lightning strike. Luwin touched the pale one with one finger, as if he were not yet brave enough to give a full hand. He drew back quickly and rubbed his finger and looked embarrassed. Cold? Ned asked. Not cold, Luwin said, and placed his hand flat on the green one. Not heat either. He searched for the word. Expectant. The pale-haired woman watched them the way a woman watching strangers hold a child would watch. A courtesy and an ache in the same breath. They came to me as stone, she said. That is what the man who sold them called them. Stone eggs. I thought. She closed her eyes a moment. It does not matter what I thought. My thoughts do not turn stone into anything else. Even so, Luwin said. Stone does not smell. These do. He smiled despite himself, delight crowning him for a moment. It is an academic's joy. Forgive me. The world must surprise us to make us more than accountants. Yora's impatience showed not as anger but as concern that expressed itself in his shoulders. We have traveled a long way to reach warmth, he said to Luwin in a tone that failed to hide a barb. If you have a place we might put them where they can drink heat from the stones, that is what my lady would ask, if asking is the word. Winterfell has heat to share, Luwin said, as if the question had offered him a chance to show off his castle like a careful housekeeper. There are basins fed by the springs that never cool. There are stones so warm that if you lay your cheek against them, they will tell you stories. The woman's fingers tightened on the rim of the chest. I do not wish to put them where they would be seen by every passing lad. Luwin raised his brows in a smile. Then we shall keep them with the old trees. The gods' wood is a private place, if we do not count the attention of the gods. The gods' wood was as near to a sanctuary as Winterfell was willing to give. The leaves that still clung to branches hung motionless while the world moved around them, a trick of the steam and the protected air within the low walls and ancient trunks. The heart tree stood with its pale bark, a face cut into it when the world was still raw. Red had run from its eyes and mouth in the way the sap of such trees will run when pierced. Over years and years the red had darkened to a rusty brown in places, like the memory of blood that won't wash out of linen. The pool beneath was a mirror to the breath of the earth. In its stillness Catelyn could never quite reconcile the warmth with the skin-splitting cold not 20 paces beyond the wall. The woman knelt on the flagstones where men used to kneel before there were steps. She laid the eggs on a flat stone that had warmed in the steam until it was almost pleasant to touch. She did everything with the attentiveness of someone who had seen the results of carelessness more often than kindness. Yora stood at a respectful distance, and Ned, with a quiet word to the gods he did not name and did not deny either, stood further back still. The wolves came and stood in a loose semicircle as if attending a small assembly, eyes bright with reflection. Ghost took up a watch near the pale egg, and his breath smoked. Lady lay down, her head on her paws, and watched with the polite gravity of a kindly mother whose child has found a frog. Grey Wind lay but sprang up again and paced, unable to cede his nerves to stillness. The woman placed her palm on each egg in turn and said something in the language of the free cities. Could have been a prayer or a recipe. Luwin listened and filed it away with the names of herbs that encouraged sleep, with the facts of ravens. The woman's words had a sound of long corners in them, like halls that had never warmed. When she rose, Ned thought that perhaps they should leave her with the children and their stone cousins. He caught Luwin's eye, and the maester nodded minutely. They stepped back among the trees and pretended to consult about incomprehensible matters, giving space, offering guard. Catelyn watched for a time from a place she knew, under a bough whose winter-stripped underside had become as familiar as the ceiling over her bed. The woman did not weep. That alone made Catelyn like her despite herself, because women who did not perform grief for others' comfort were either saints or difficult, and Catelyn had never had much patience for saints. Sansa came to stand beside her mother. She did not speak. The wonder had taken language for a moment and hidden it in its sleeve. Arya came to stand on Catelyn's other side and rocked on her heels, impatient for something she could not name to happen. Bran crept along the low wall like a lizard, twice glancing to see if Catelyn would send him away. She did not. There were worse things for children to watch than a quiet woman placing old stones on a warm rock. Night made itself known gradually, the godswood accepting it as it did weather. Lamps were brought by a serving girl, which made the place feel less like a grove and more like a room without a roof. The older heir took the lamplight and stirred it among steam like someone diluting wine. The eggs lay with their matte sheen like the hides of 3 sleeping animals. The woman did not leave them. She ate bread from a basket someone had placed on the stone lip of the pool and drank watered wine that steamed in the cup. Jorah went and came and went, unable to sit. Each return he was surprised she had not moved. The wolves grew bored and drifted away and then returned, like boys at the edges of a game. The heart tree watched without blinking, because the heart tree never blinked. Toward midnight, the red comet, not red in the north as men named it elsewhere but a roped fire pulled thin by the cold, appeared. Its tail smeared the sky above the godswood so that for a time the heart tree's reflection wore a crown. Bran lay on his back along the wall and looked up because his neck had not yet learned to ache. He saw a streak of brightness that made him think of the inside of an iron bar when Mikken worked it, that cherry-colored secret. The woman's mouth moved without sound. She sat cross-legged, the posture of those who have known boats and prayer both, and held her palms over the eggs, not touching, as if the air an inch above them mattered. Ghost came and laid his head on her thigh and remained there without fidgeting, which made Arya's eyes widen and Sansa's lips make a small, involuntary shape. Jon did not speak much when he came to stand beside Ned, which made Ned think better of him in a way he could not say. Jon watched the woman with that clear attention he had inherited from someone Ned had ached after and had never been able to name aloud. Ghost blinked at him and then closed his eyes again in the way of animals who have decided they can trust a person to keep watch. Near morning, when the mist had thickened and the air within the godswood took on the flavor of a room that has been breathed by too many, a change came. At first it was so gentle that Catelyn thought her wont was playing tricks. The faintest tremor of sound, like bees trapped in a wall in late summer. Luwin tilted his head as if trying to remember a piece of music. Jorah stood with his hands at his sides and did not breathe for the length of 2 heartbeats. The pale egg, the one with gold's thread and the heavy milk hue, made a sound like a brittle smile. A flaw opened across it as fine as a hair in glass. Steam from the pool condensed on the shell and beaded there like sweat. The woman did not exclaim. Her hands shifted, one above, one below, as if she were the scale between music and silence. The black egg spoke next, a noise so small it would have been lost in a room that allowed other sounds, but here it threaded itself between them. The green egg quivered but did not yet show a seam. Old Nan was not there, but Catelyn could hear her voice anyway. Once there were things with wings, and they were no more of men than storms are, and men thought they could tame them and called that mastery, and then winter took both men and their arrogance. The crack spread. It was not a dramatic shattering but a series of polite apertures, one yielding to the next. The shells did not so much break as become something else. Ned found he had his hand on Jon's shoulder and did not remove it, though Jon leaned forward as if he had been beckoned. When the first one, pale and gold, spilled its occupant into the damp light, there was no roar. There was a wet sound like a newborn's first struggle to breathe where air is rude. The creature that moved was not large, and that was a grace. It seemed smaller for being new. It had the indifference of animals whose arrival is its own authority. Its wings were crumpled and translucent at the edges, the membranes webbed with fine threads that told stories of their own. Its eyes opened and were not human and did not want to be. Its breath did not look like smoke. In the cool of the godswood, Its exhalation whispered white in a way that made Catelyn think of her own breath winter mornings when she had run as a girl along the Greystone Wall at Riverrun, chasing her brother who always let her catch him. The little creature's first act was to press its head against what had been its home and swallow a small piece of shell as if to acknowledge a debt. The pale hide under its wet scales gleamed where lamplight kissed it. As heat from the stone rose and the steam embraced, the pale sheen seemed to catch frost as a game, a lace of silver that vanished in an instant. The black one arrived next, impatient where the first had been dignified. Came out of the shell biting. The red veins underwriting its darkness brightened as if waking to their own pee. Erpos. It snapped its jaws 3 times in the air and made a small dissatisfied sound that made Rob's mouth open in astonishment. Grey Wind, from where he had returned to stand near Rob's leg, growled softly, but not in anger, more in recognition. The green allowed itself the time of a breath between the others, as if unwilling to join a story that was already told until it could claim a way to stand within it. Its scales took the lamplight and returned something softer than shine, a gloss like the back of an old leaf. When it came, it unfolded with ceremony and shook itself, scattering droplets that smoked and then were gone. All 3 leaned into the steam as if they had come home to a breath they recognized. Their little chests moved quickly. They were graceless in the way only very new things are, and in that gracelessness was a beauty men seldom forgive, because it does not need to ask permission. The woman had not moved from her place. She made a sound that was not quite a sob and not yet a laugh. She made another sound afterward, a word in the language of her childhood that had a shape like a keel cracking ice. She lowered her hands and then lifted one to touch the pale one's head with a finger as careful as any touch she had ever given a living thing. The little creature tolerated this early presumption and leaned into it the way a cur might lean into scratches if it has never been given one. Yora breathed then, a sound like a sack of grain being set down after too long a carry. He stepped forward and stopped himself and then stepped back, as if he were trying to leave the room in which he had always wanted to be allowed. Luwin's eyes were wet. He could not help it and forgave himself. "Not stone," he said softly, as if confessing a fault to his gods. "Not stone," the woman agreed. She looked up at Ned, and he saw that grief and joy had not negated one another in her face. They had found a way to be neighbors. Winter is a teaching. We have all told ourselves this. I have learned it, but the world is sometimes generous. There were burns on her palms where she had held the shells in those last finger breaths before they gave. The steam had done what it could, and the cold had stolen some of the pain, but the skin was reddened and blistered in small crescents. She did not seem to notice yet, which worried Ned more than the burns did, because he knew how shock sometimes behaves, polite at first and then abrupt. "Let us get you out of the damp," he said, not entirely sure who he was addressing. The wolves stood at attention. The dragons, for he would have to call them that now, had begun to explore their own length numbly the way newborns will try to discover that they have feet. The black one nipped at a lamplight moth and then inhaled it by accident and sneezed, startled by the indignity. The pale one watched all with the gravity of a judge and made a small whistling noise between breaths. The godswood accepted what had occurred with the same indifference it had for weddings and deaths. The heart tree's face did not change. The pool steamed. A bird called once in the branches, a private signal to others whose meanings men had never fully translated. When Catelyn followed them across the yard back toward the keep, the sky had begun to think about dawn. Steam from the kitchen vents made banners that looked like ghost flags above the roofline. A serving boy dropped a stack of tin plates and swore and then looked around, embarrassed. Arya ran ahead and then forced herself to slow, because she wanted to arrive in an orderly fashion and not as someone who had to be told to behave. Sansa walked as if she had been told she was a lady to match what she had just seen, and for a moment she succeeded. Bran came last because he had stayed to touch the stone that had been warmed by the eggs. He planted his hand there and felt something in his palm, not a vibration but a kind of low invitation, like a drum played 2 rooms away. In the corridor, the steam made droplets on the stone like sweat. The dragons made little noises that were not quite chirps and not quite the beginnings of language. sounds that suggested a throat discovering it could make itself known. The pale one's breath, when it met the cold seeping under the door from the yard, bloomed white. It turned its head and looked at that bloom, fascinated, and exhaled again as if to make more. The black one curled its tail around the pale one's tail in sleep when sleep finally arrived, and the green pressed its ribbed side along the woman's skirt as if to find a heartbeat there. Old Nan, who had no business being anywhere she was not meant to be but always found it, stood at the corner and watched them go past with the expression of someone who had taken a bet against her own skepticism and lost. She did not curtsy. She did not lift her hand to make any warding sign. She did not speak. Her eyes, never kind when curious, softened a fraction when Luwin passed and looked at her. She shook her head once and went back the way she had come, to tell no one except the little boy who always crept into her room and begged for nightmares. Ned brought the woman to the solar instead of the hall, because he did not wish the hall to gather her up and turn her into a story before he had decided what obligations came with her. The fire was already lit. The warmth here was different from the gods' wood, less like a cave and more like the skin of a well-fed animal. Caitlin sent for wine that did not taste like winter and for cloth and salve. Someone found honey salve and nettle to chew for shock. The woman sat in the high-backed chair and placed the pale dragon on her knees, and the green slept on one boot. The black had crawled under the chair as if to lay claim to its belly. "No names," she said to Yora when he hovered, and he nodded as if she had spoken of weather. "Not yet," he murmured. "Names are a kind of plan." Luwin bent to examine. The burns. The skin was angry and would be worse later when anger had had time to dress in swelling. He looked up and said gently, "It is a fair thing to feel pain. There are folk in old stories who do not feel it, and those tales seldom end well. Allow me to teach you the humility of blistering." She smiled with half her mouth. "Teach me," she said, patient in a way that had nothing to do with submission. Ned moved to the window and looked out, where the first light had laid paleness along the crenellations. Beyond the walls the world was white and gray and implacable. The pines along the ridge stirred as if they had heard a rumor they wanted to argue about. A raven made a single sound that could have been commentary or hunger. He looked down into the yard where men were beginning the day and thought of how many sentences he would have to speak before noon. He thought of a time in a tower when he had been given a child to keep safe and had accepted the weight without consideration of the years. He thought of a king who hunted in forests too far south to smell snow. When Theon slid into the solar like a knife into quiet cloth, he brought with him the draft of the yard and the grin that he wore like a shield. "My lord," he said, and half bowed toward Ned and then toward Caitlin. And only at the end of the half-bows did he attach any attention to the woman with the small monsters at her knees. His grin broadened. "Well," he said, "what pretty lizards you've brought north. We are in need of something to frighten away tedium." Yora looked at him with the bored disdain of a veteran toward a boy who thought swagger could be bleached into competence. "Some things are not for frightening away anything," he said. "They are for reminding us what matters." Theon's grin held, which was something he did well. Springs in the walls and a menagerie in the solar. I should have stayed a ward all my life if I had known Winterfell hid such toys. Jon, when he entered after Theon, did not speak at once. He stood for a moment as if the world had grown new edges and he was choosing where to place his hands. Ghost went and lay against the chair leg where the black dragon had hidden. He never much cared what Theon said because it always sounded like a boy trying to keep the room's attention on himself. He cared very much about what Ned did and did not say, and in that he had inherited both a wound and a strength. Caitlin bound the woman's hands and did not ask the question she did not want answered. If there were answers that would drag them all into the South's net, she would not be the one to pull the first thread. She worked with the gentleness of women who have tended men too proud to admit when blood leaves them. The woman watched her work and did not flinch. The pale dragon lifted its head to watch too, eyes like melted coin, and then it breathed out a little thread of white that dissipated at once. Caitlin felt the oddest emotion. Annoyance, as if the creature were a child blowing on her stitching. She laughed under her breath at herself and tied off the bandage as if she were binding her own wrists, not a stranger's. "Thank you," the woman said to her at last. The words were simple, and the tiredness that moved under them like a fish under ice made Caitlyn's throat tighten in sympathy. It was nothing to ask for truth and expect it. Even so, the name arrived with the humility of something that had been stored too long and might crumble. Daenerys. The air in the room changed shape. No one gasped. Men whose lives have been spent among oaths are careful with their inhalations. But there was a stillness and then an adjustment as if everyone's weight had shifted from one leg to the other. Ned closed his eyes and saw a blue flower lying on a bed of snow. He opened them. "You are a guest of Winterfell," he said, and the words were more important than the name, and they made themselves heavy enough to stand on. "Then I am one," she said simply. "I did not come here to ask you to kill or be killed in my name. I came because this is a place that remembers what warmth is, because I needed a roof that believes its purpose, because I am not safe elsewhere, and I am tired of not being safe." Robb, who had been quiet because something in him told him that quiet was the stance befitting someone to whom wolves listen, stepped forward. He looked from Ned to the woman to the creatures and back. "What will you call them?" he asked, as if to push against the moment with a boy's question. "They will tell me," she said without irony. "Names are not blankets to be thrown over faces. They are bridges to the thing itself. I will learn their names when they are ready to answer." Theon snorted and then grinned again when no one bothered to argue with him. Sansa stared as if memorizing for a song that she would one day perform for a hall that clapped politely and believed none of it. Arya tried to calculate how fast these small things could be sent to fetch her a rabbit if she asked right. Bran looked out the window because a winter sun had found the corner where snow always lingered and drifted sparkles into the air, which was magic enough for any boy. Later that morning, when word had been left to grow on the walls like lichen, and the men whose job it was to tell tales in God's cursed places did what men always do when told, the first ravens flew with new ink on their messages. Not many and not yet. Ned was careful, but he was not secretive in ways that made him a stranger to himself. He sent a bird to Bear Island because hospitality to a Mormont would mend a cloth that had torn. He sent one to White Harbor because a letter had come from there and because the Manderleys had always been practical fools, steadfast in the ridiculous ways that made good neighbors. He did not send south. Not yet. Word was a living thing and it moved even with clipped wings. By the time the sun had dried the stones along the stern wall, no one in Winterfell was ignorant. Even the kitchen girls whose business was onions and that small pinch of spice you put in gravy that makes men want it again knew. The word dragon dripped like fat off a spit. Children put their heads together and sent their pretend soldiers under tables to slay them and then resurrect them when their pretend queens cried. The men in the guardhouse said nothing at all, which meant they had said the things that mattered already and would not be overheard repeating themselves. Daenerys slept in the great bed piled with quilts because she had not slept in longer than a body can reasonably be expected to stay careful. Jorah sat in a chair just outside her door. He put his sword across his knees because he had learned very late in his life that swords are not about cutting. They are about waiting. The dragons, there, he had named them in his head at last, slept in a heap on the rug in front of the hearth after they had been fed, and they slept so hard they had forgotten to make themselves ordinary. The pale one's breath continued to plume white off and on in its sleep. The black one twitched and growled and then hiccuped smoke smell that made the room's air startle. The green snored. Jorah had not known dragons could snore, but he was learning. Ned stood over the writing desk with one of the castle's quills in his hand and the problem that words always make. See too little, lie. See too much, betray. He wrote one letter and then another and then tore both. He did not write south. He walked to the window again and looked at the yard again, and nothing had changed and all of it had. At midday, the Bear Island women found him. They were sisters. That was obvious, though no one had introduced them as such. They had the look of women who had been taught to hold the mouths of men closed with the backs of their hands if necessary, and they did not speak as if asking permission. Their cloaks smelled like good fur and their hair looked like it could tear combs. They nodded at Ned as if acknowledging that, in a place of men, he might be expected to stand near the center of a line and hold it. They asked for Jorah and did not flinch when he came. "Your aunt will skin you or forgive you," the taller one said to him briskly, as if they had left the rest of the sentence behind them, which might have been, "If you are lucky, she will do both. Bear Island sends sense. You will answer to it, though you haven't listened before." Yora nodded. "Sense is a dress I will try to wear," he said, and the woman snorted and grinned despite herself. They were given food and a place near a fire where no one would bother them except to ask if the clan women of Bear Island truly fought in mail. They answered those questions in a manner that sent boys away with complicated dreams. Sansa came again and again to the solar and sat with her hands folded and her eyes turned toward gentleness as if it were a needlework lesson. She watched Daenerys without speaking much. She made herself useful by holding the cup when Luwin changed the bandages or by carrying a tray of small scraps of meat cut thin for dragon mouths. When she smiled, it was the smile of a girl speaking to a friend she had not yet met but was certain she would like when they did. Arya stood in the doorway most of the time and then came in on a quick impulse, spoke too loudly and asked questions that caused Septa Mordain to hiss they were not proper. Daenerys did not mind improper questions. She had lived in cities where the only question men asked a woman was a bargain. She answered Arya as if she were speaking to someone who would one day read a battlefield the way she was now reading a room. Bran asked if they would grow very big and if they would let him ride them when they did. Luwin began a lecture on how riding dragons was not something men did now or perhaps ever. Bran lost track of the lecture and began to plan his seat anyway, deciding which hand he would use to hold on. Rickon crept in at last, small as a question, and Daenerys did not look at him at once. Instead, she put her hand on the floor, palm up, and let the small black dragon crawl onto it as if it had been asked. Rickon approached and put one finger out and touched the dragon's tail. His face a careful blank because he was pretending not to care if it snapped. The dragon did not snap. Rickon's mouth opened in a way that made Catelyn think of the first time he had seen snow catch a sunbeam and make 1,000 bright pieces that the hand could not hold. Theon told stories in the yard that afternoon, of sea fights he had not fought and girls he had not kissed, until Robb laughed and called him a liar and Theon laughed and said all good stories were lies first. Jon took practice with a spear because he had decided that if the world raised winged things then a man should put his faith in reach rather than heft. He heard Theon say something unkind in passing and did not respond because words spoken simply to be burned did not need fuel. At dusk, the shade of the gods would turn to iron. The ravens on the rookery woke one by one as if the night tickled their wings. Winterfell exhaled with the sound of men coming in and laying down what they had carried out. The dragons woke just before the last bell. They woke hungry and impatient. The Pale One watched the frost it could make and made more and laughed in whatever language such creatures own. That night, Daenerys dreamed. She dreamed the same dream she had dreamed since she was a girl, only now the walls had a different texture. She dreamed of a hall with pillars like trunks and a floor that moved under her feet with the subtle undulation of a ship. She dreamed of a voice speaking a language she had never learned and had always known, the syllables putting their hands inside her ribs to rearrange what they found there gently. In the dream, her brother came and he was not a brother because brothers do not bring knives to infants' names days. He melted instead, not in cruelty but because heat had found him where he was brittle. She woke with a soft cry that could have been sorrow and was not, with her palms throbbing and the smell of old sap in her nose. Yora sat where he had sat, not sleeping because he had watched too many men die of unsurprising disappointments while their guards slept. He looked at her and did not ask her what she had seen. The dragons rustled and settled. The Pale One crawled up on the bed and slept near her shoulder and exhaled white that became nothing and then the kind of cool that makes the skin call to memory heat to answer it. Far to the north, beyond the wall, they said the dead did not sleep. Men at the wall told themselves many things. One of the things they told themselves was that what lay beyond wanted nothing they had to give. On that night, a woman with hair like primed flax, born to a man whose name had been forgotten by any who mattered to him and mothered by a grief who had kept better records, woke in a bed under a roof that belonged to the first season of the North, and 3 creatures who had never seen snow exhaled and inhaled in time with her, and the air heard. After midnight, Ned went to the crypts. He walked down the steps with a lamp and the heat diminished by degrees until the air was thick and tasted like old coins. The carved faces of the kings and not kings of the north watched him with the polite malice of stone. He did not feel judged. He felt observed. He stood before a statue whose hands held a sword across its knees and thought of the day he had come down these steps with his sister in his arms. He had thought then that if he put her here, he might be able to leave a part of himself too and then go upstairs lighter. He had been wrong, but not in a way that had made him any harsher with his sons. He spoke aloud because the crypts did not repeat back what they heard. "Tell me if I am wrong," he said to stone. "Tell me if this is foolishness. Tell me if I am about to put my house under an avalanche." He waited and heard only the sound the lamp makes when the oil moves against glass. He laughed then softly. "Even the dead do not wish to do my thinking for me," he said, and turned back up to the world where children learn their names and men try to guess what women dream. The third day after the hatching, a white raven came with the unhurried dignity that white ravens employ. It sat on the perch in the rookery and let itself be captured by the maester as if indulgent. It had a ribbon braided into its leg with 3 knots. Luwin read the message and frowned, not with distress but with the concentration of a man whose mind has been given a new rug and must decide whether to unroll it. He carried the letter down to Ned and then to Daenerys because he had decided that information dumped on one person made that person cold, but shared among several it warmed the room. "From the Citadel," he said, because white ravens always came from there. Not unusual when a king's name day drawing near or when seasons decide to make pronouncements. He held it in his good hand. The chain around his neck tinkled. A drawer of learned toys rattled. He read aloud. "In recognition of the evidence gathered by our brothers and scouts and in council with lore, they do enjoy their prefaces. We declare the old summer ended and a true winter begun, long and earnest. Let all men husband what can be stored and all women count what can be spared." He looked up. "They do not say how long. They never do." The hall received this not as surprise but as affirmation of what joints had been saying and what cattle had quietly admitted to the keepers who do not make them into songs. Men went to the granaries and counted with an abacus. Women took berries out of the line and moved them to the pot where salted pork sat waiting to be cozened. Boys practiced wearing gloves while working the pump. The news did not change behavior so much as give it the dignity of being called a plan. Daenerys took the letter in her bandaged hands and looked at the seal. "Winter declared by men who never see your winters," she said. "Useful." Luwin smiled to deflect offense. "We pretend the world needs our pronouncements," he said, "and sometimes we are right." "How long?" Jon asked, and Luwin, because he loved boys who believed facts would do as they were told him things he did not know and perhaps could not have known, about astronomers and seasons as long as memories and as brief as prayers. Through that day, the dragons grew more insistent. Their bodies did the work that all new bodies do, of becoming themselves. The green's wings strengthened and it practiced beating them and jumped up and thumped back down with offended dignity. The black tried to climb the chair again and again until it discovered the trick of the leg molding under the seat and then did so as if it had invented furniture. The pale opened its mouth and showed a tongue that looked like the inside of a shell and exhaled a long, deliberate breath that smoked more than before and left, on the table where it made its experiment, a faint print of rime. Arya touched it with the back of her knuckles and squealed. "It's not cold," she said, surprised, delighted. "It looks cold and it isn't." She looked at Daenerys, whom she had begun to call Dany when no one scolded her for the familiarity. "It lies," she said in approval, as only a child can sanction such a thing. "It persuades," Daenerys said, "like a song." Theon told Robb that he should put his name as a banner near these creatures before someone wrote the wrong name there. Robb laughed and told Theon he could stand a little closer if he needed to keep his courage warm. Jon stood with Ghost and did not tell anyone what he felt, which was that something had arrived that had more to do with him than anyone knew and that he would need to learn how to be the Sis. Of it. That evening, under a sky that had congealed into pearl, men began to arrive in ones and twos. Word had flown like the white raven and not needed ribbon. An umber from last hearth came with a laugh that made men clasp their cups tighter. A little Glover came on a shaggy horse that had opinions. Daisy Mormont walked into the yard with her helmet under her arm and took Yora's measure with a look and then put her gloved hand on his shoulder briefly. Forgiveness and future scolding in the same touch. The yard filled with voices that came from the north and with boots that had walked long on poor roads. They came to see dragons, as our ancestors came to see comets, and they had the rough humility that honest awe teaches. They had questions that were the good sort: what do we feed them? What do they mean when they make that noise? Do they bite? And the bad sort: what will the South do now that the North has something the South thought extinct? Ned took his seat at the high table and tried not to feel as if he had stolen it. He looked at his sons and daughters and at the pale-haired woman named Daenerys and at the dragons who did not ask for titles. He looked at the carved direwolf in the rafters and thought that the old gods were perhaps less old than the things that had come out of stone 2 days ago, and that the gods would therefore tolerate them, because the gods had always had a sense of scale. He was not wrong in that moment to think the North would rise. He did not yet know what shape rising would take, and he did not need to. Men will often pretend they do, and the world undresses their certainty quickly enough. When the feast began, it did so as feasts do, with the comfortable clatter of plates. The toasts that tried to pretend offense at the names is not the way of kin. The dragons slept through the first course. They woke for the stewed apples with cinnamon and the roast fowl and turned their heads at the scent of fat splitting under knife. They were not invited to the trestle, though Rickon, in his trying to be taller than his years, smuggled them scraps he had tucked into his sleeve. Daenerys did not stop him because she had been a child who had smuggled kindness to things that would die without it. Yora watched carefully, because dragons biting children might become a song sung in a key that ends in swords. When the noise had risen to a pleasant insistence and the women from Bear Island had begun to argue, in good spirits, with a man from White Harbor about the proper size of a fish, Daenerys felt the world shift. It does that sometimes for those who have been forced to grow stillness within themselves. There is a moment when the air alters, becomes more attentive, as if a stranger stepped just outside the door and lifted a hand but did not knock. She put her fingers in the mouth of the pale one, not because she was foolish, but because she had learned there are acts that tell us whether the story we have chosen is the right one, and we must perform them at the irrefutable moments. The pale one did not bite. It opened wider and allowed her to feel the warmth within its throat, a warmth that was not heat but something more articulate. It exhaled. Her hand came away damp where the exhalation had condensed into a fine dew, and the dew became frost and then nothing. She laughed low because she had known men who thought they were dangerous and had never known when to laugh, and here was danger that had a sense of humor. Sansa saw and smiled and glanced down the table to see who else had noticed. Arya saw and began to make a plan to steal the smallest of the three for an hour, which plan would go poorly and she would laugh about it years later, telling boys with spears how once she had tried to hide a dragon under her cloak and had nearly singed her eyebrows off when it sneezed with offended propriety. Robb saw and gripped the handle of his cup more firmly and looked at Theon as if to say, "We may be allowed some arrogance now if we wear it clean." Jon saw and thought of the top of the wall and of fires lit there that did not want to go out, and of a girl's face he could not yet bring into focus but which he would someday. Ned saw and thought simply, "The South has no right to this." It was an odd thought for a man who believed in duty as a shape, but it arrived anyway and sat down in his mind like a tired traveler. The next morning dawned with the particular quiet that comes when snow has fallen in the night. The yard had that muffled aspect winter sometimes wears, as if sound had been wrapped in cloth. Footprints wrote new stories across it and then were overwritten by others. Breath made plumes that drifted like flags deciding what wind they rode. The dragons went to the Godswood again, because there are places where creatures know they belong even if they have never been before. Ghost went with them like a pale idea. They walked there with Daenerys and with children and with Yora and with Luwin and with Ned because the world had grown very small, no larger than Winterfell, and because inexplicably that felt right. The South was always larger in the mouths of men than in the hand, but the North now had made itself into a weight. And what is a kingdom but a thing that can be weighed? At the pool, steam rose and made patterns that would have been language if anyone there had known how to read it. The heart tree stood as patient as ever. The pale dragon climbed the same stone where it had been warmed and lay down as if to say, "I will listen here." The black moved to the base of the tree and looked up as if considering a flight that would end in a brief and glorious crash. The green turned circles with the solemnity of a hound and then lay with its eyes closed but not asleep. Daenerys knelt as she had knelt on that first night. But now her hands were bandaged, and she knew what her mouth would say when it opened. She did not address the gods of the place. She spoke to the air, and to her own blood and to the creatures she had woken by refusing to die when the world had required it of her. Ned stood behind her and folded his hands and felt, for once, that he was not the only man in the place who carried old promise in his bones. A raven flapped low over the god's wood, too low. It had a strip of red cloth tied to its leg, not the white of the citadel's dignities. It landed on the low wall and hopped and spoke in that rough voice birds use when messages want to be public. Luwin reached and the bird stepped onto his hand because ravens from the north knew a maester's wrists the way a hound knows the hand that feeds it. He took the ribbon and unknotted it and read the little slip of parchment. His face did not change until the end, when the corners of his mouth went down as if the news were bitter in the way of medicine that works. "From the wall," he said. "Ben-Jen." He paused because names have weight. He looked at Ned. "From the wall," he repeated, steadier. "There are stories, men not returning, things moving where they ought to not, a request for more men of sense and less men of stories." Ned lifted his eyes as if he could see in that direction through stone and tree and weather. He had known this would come at some point. He had not expected it today. "We will send what we can," he said, a sentence as inevitable as the need to drink. Daenerys listened, because listening had become the first act of every day. She put her unbandaged palm on the pale dragon's back and felt its breath lift it gently. "I will go to see your wall," she said, a sentence that surprised her when she heard herself say it and did not, as some sentences do, immediately try to take itself back. "Dragons prefer high places, and I am tired of rooms." Ned turned to her, startled into a kind of smile by the plainness of this. "It is no small thing," he said, as if reminding her of the height of ladders. "I have crossed things that believed themselves larger," she answered, and the pale one turned its head and looked at the steam and exhaled, and for an instant a lace of frost wrote itself in the air and then vanished like the end of a prayer. The north would rise, not as men in stories like to tell it, with banners lifting and trumpets, not at first. It would rise the way bread rises, quietly, in warmth, with patience, because some older weight has been woken within it. Women counted grain and coats. Men made decisions about which temper of steel to choose. Wolves learned new smells and accepted them and moved on. Children told each other in whispers what names they would assign to beings who do not answer to names. The sky stayed as it had been, honest, unadorned, not interested in men's songs. And deep under the yard, under the warm stones and the cold ones, under the oldest of Winterfell's thoughts, something else turned to listen, as if a buried memory had stretched in its sleep and decided perhaps it was time to wake. Morning turned itself over in the sky and found the same pale underside, as if the day were a fish caught and turned for cleaning. Snow had fallen in the night and left a new skin on the yard. Men learned where the old smooth slipped and where the fresh powder held. In corners where steam drifted, the snow had melted and then refrozen in panes that reflected sky. Winterfell breathed as it always did, only now, if a person stood very still in the bells between dawn and the first clatter of buckets. A low sound came through the stones, not quite a hum, not quite the memory of one. Luwin, standing in a corridor near a vent with a hand on the wall, decided it was the springs, as men will decide what they are able to understand. In the solar, Ned and Catelyn sat with Daenerys and Yora and listened to the air making ordinary noises of a keep. The scrape of a chair across the hall, a woman's laughter 2 rooms away, the heavy footfall of Hodder as he carried a brazier that sizzled in the cold like meat on iron. The dragons had assumed places in the room that suggested they had begun to think of it as a den. The pale one liked the corner where the heat from the hearth lifted and curled. It would stand there with its mouth slightly open, letting breath slip out and watching it turn to a lace that vanished before it could land. The green liked the windowsill, where it could press belly to stone warmed by sun. The black had discovered the underside of furniture and had claimed the space beneath Ned's great oak writing table with an air of industry. dragging discarded bits of twine and a small wooden peg and a fallen goose feather there as if to build a secret. "We cannot pretend the wall did not write," Ned said, holding the folded message from the raven, though he had long since memorized the ink marks. "If men are not returning, we send men. It has been so since men kept watch. Benjen has asked for sense and steadiness. Sense and steadiness we have, and we will part with some." "I will go," Daenerys said. She took the habit of speaking simply and found it effective. "If your watch will have a visitor who brings trouble with her." "You are not trouble," Catelyn said, a little too quickly, an echo of the part of herself that liked to see a thing and name it kindly before it could earn another name. "You are a guest." "I am both," Daenerys said, with a calm that made the statement bearable. "I have learned to move my weight carefully. These creatures," she glanced at the pale, the green, the black, "prefer high places. The cold does not dissuade them. The air near the wall is an old thing. I would feel how it breathes." Luwin came in then, a small stack of old vellum under his arm bound up with soft leather thongs, the way a man brings out his own childhood to examine it with an adult's eyes. "There is not much in the histories we can trust," he said, as if he had walked in mid-conversation, which he often did. "Men wrote about dragons the way they write about STO. RMS, after the fact, with too much fear or too much bravado. But there are lines here." He set the vellum on the table, the black dragon under it expressing displeasure with a soft complaint. "About how the old writers chose places that breathe warmth, hot springs, lava vents. The dragons will like your gods would. But there are also accounts, odd little notes in margins more than once, of creatures who enjoyed cold chalk cliffs and glacier edges where wind scrapes. That part the singers do not make much of. Cold is a poor rhyme partner." He offered a rueful smile to the dragons and then to the room. "I do not know what they will make of ice that goes up to the sky. Do not dress the journey in learning until it cannot move," Yora muttered, respectful enough in the tone he offered the maester, but a man's impatience visible under it. "We need men and wagons and food that can be eaten with gloves on. We need to wrap the creatures." He refused the word dragon for a breath and then allowed it. "In furs they will not bite through and find a way to keep their stones warm." "Their stones?" Sansa asked from the doorway. She had come in with a tray without asking if she should and therefore had not been given the chance to be told no. She wore a fur-lined cloak and snow still clung to the edges. She had made a path through the yard that she would later admire from the rampart. She set the tray down and adjusted the cup handles so they faced the hands that would take them. "The things I heated the first night in the gods would," Daenerys said. "Flat stones?" She looked at Ned to confirm. "That drink the springs. They hold warmth. I will not cage these three, but there are times when help is not insult. I will take the stones and a brazier when the wind wins." Sansa looked at the dragons with the seriousness of someone memorizing a needlework pattern in her mind. "I can sew furs into a cap for the brazier," she said, surprising herself with a practical suggestion that did not sound like a song's refrain. "If we make a hood for it, the heat will stay under. I have scraps. There is always something left from trimming a cloak. I could line it with an old quilt." "She could," Maester Luwin said, pleased. "And she will. We'll contrive straps to keep it safe." Arya appeared behind Sansa, hair damp from snow melted by steam, cheeks so pink they could have been painted by a brisk wind with artistic pretensions. "I'm going," she announced to no one in particular and everyone in general. "You are not," Catelyn said without heat, the way a woman says no to lightning. "I'm not," Arya said, as if the refusal had introduced an interesting new opponent to be observed. "But Jon is." Catelyn's eyes flicked to Ned. He held her gaze a fraction too long, and that was answer enough. "Jon will go," he said. "He knows the road. He'll bring letters north and bring letters back, and he will look with his uncle's eyes. Ghost will keep him honest." Ghost, from the corner, lifted his head as if someone had just told a joke he had heard before and liked anyway. "And me?" Theon leaned in the threshold, cheerful insolence slung easy on his shoulders. "I've always wanted to see the wall before it falls down from boredom. Besides, your brother will miss me, and I would not wish the commander to go without a laugh." "No," Ned said, not unkindly. "You will not." If Theon had been a better student of men, he might have heard the shape under that word. Not now, not this time, perhaps not ever to that place. He grinned anyway because that had kept him alive this long. "I suppose someone must stay and drink your ale," he said. "Someone must," Ned agreed. "It will make a change to have you do it under orders." Theon laughed properly then. He took a cup from Sansa's tray and kissed her hand in a way that made her blush and dropped the spoon she had set too near the edge. Arya rolled her eyes and scowled, because she was not yet old enough to enjoy being made uncertain by a grin. She wanted certainty she could strike with a stick until it squealed. They began to gather what journeys require. The Yard took on the purposeful look Winterfell wore when sending men out to hunt, only now the prey was not an animal with a foreseeable shape. Leather was oiled, buckles checked. A wagon that had recently been carrying split oak was scrubbed, its bed lined with plank and then with layers of old hides. Under Luwin's strict eye, a brazier that had once heated the coldest of the crows' roosts was adapted. Long iron legs were fitted so that it could sit steady in the wagon and not scorch the wood, and hooks were hammered and set so that held stones could be lifted in and out with long-handled tongs. Sansa sewed with cheeks still pink, and the cap for the brazier took shape under her hands. Quilt batting and fur married by small strong stitches that did not pretend to be pretty and therefore were. Daisy Mormont volunteered without ceremony that sounded like a boast. "I'll go," she said, pushing her helmet under her arm again, as if she and it had had another argument and she had promised to hold it again later. "I have always wanted to see if the stories about the Wall are lazy. I mistrust men who speak of size as if it cannot be measured by a woman's eyes." "Take 2 of mine," Ned told her, meaning guards, and she nodded once as if to accept men the way one accepts weather, something to be managed. Catelyn attended to food as if it were the most complex of magics. Oats were counted, hard cheese examined for mold and trimmed to the necessary circles, salt pork sliced and wrapped. There were things that tasted better under a cold sky than under a roof. She made sure those things were included. She put in a jar of pickled beets because she had learned that men who eat color look brighter even when they are not. She added a packet of dried juniper to put in the water when it is boiled. It would smell like a small forest and make men sigh and pretend they were resting. Bran came and stood too near the wagon and was told to move and did so and then returned to just as near, which is a boy's way of learning how close a body can get to the door of a thing without being pushed inside. He watched the dragons being handled with the kind of rapt delight that is not noisy because anything more than breath would make the moment go. The pale one let him stroke its back with 2 fingers. It exhaled and his cheeks prickled as if pins had been held near his skin. But there was no pain to complain of, no cold to flinch away from, only sensation, like standing near a waterfall and feeling the air beat. Jon made his preparations quietly. Ghost followed him step for step and then went elsewhere and then returned because there were men in the yard today who needed counting and labeling and Ghost liked to count. Jon rolled his cloak in a way that would leave the dry part inside when the outside froze. He oiled the leather strap that held his knife and then set the knife down and looked at it as if expecting it to confess something about the future. It did not, being a good knife and therefore silent. In the dim still before supper, Catelyn found Jon in the corridor where the floor always sweated in winter. His breath made fog that softened the sharpness of his face. He straightened when he saw her, a courtesy that had been hammered into him by a boyhood of reading her eyes before she spoke. "You will be careful," she said, because it was possible to put those words in a mouth without allowing great harm to ride on them. She heard herself and found, to her small private astonishment, that she meant them. "I will," he said, and then, because he had learned equally well when to be honest, "I don't know what careful is at the Wall, but I will watch, and when I do not know, I will ask. I will listen to my uncle." "I do not love that you go," she said, and that was more truthful than kindness would have been. "I know," he said softly. He did not avert his eyes, and that made her recognize him for a moment in the way she sometimes, against her better judgment, recognized the curve of a lip or the angle of a cheekbone she would not admit she knew. But it is the Wall. She could not refuse him that sentence. She stepped back to allow the moment to close. He moved past, his shoulder almost brushing hers. She stood there a breath longer, and then she shook her head at herself because she had work. That night, old Nan told stories because there was a restlessness in the keep, and restless men and women like to dress it in other people's long troubles. She sat in her chair near a fire that popped and let her thin hands roam like spiders in her lap. Children gathered on benches and on the floor, Sansa with her sewing in her lap forgotten, Arya sitting cross-legged and solemn with determination not to be sent to bed if she made a noise, Bran leaning against a settle, a tension like a rope pulled taut between him and the old woman's voice. Daenerys stood in the back of the room, unremarkable in a plain cloak, her hair braided back from her face, Yora a respectful post at her shoulder. The dragons were not brought. Even wonders must sometimes be allowed to be rumors. Old Nan spoke of the long night the way a woman speaks of a season she survived. She spoke of men who had learned to make songs that would not freeze on their tongues, and of women who had wrapped newborns in wolves' cast-off winter fur, and of children who marked the years on the underside of stair treads with a knife kept only for that counting. She spoke of lights moving like thoughts across frozen rivers, and of a king who had been so hungry he ate his own oath and had to learn to live without it. When she named the others, she did not make them monsters from a southern boy's terror. She made them precise, indifferent, beautiful in the way of ice that grows feathers on a window when a woman's breath tips it toward art. They come when the world is not paying attention to its own breathing, she said, and her voice made a shape in the air that would hang there long after the children went to bed. And they do not think of us any more than a well thinks of a bucket. In her sleep that night, Daenerys dreamed that the heart tree woke and put its roots down through the warm stones and found, beneath, a channel where water sang. She dreamed that she stood there with bare feet and the water touched her with a hand made of time and salt and iron. When she woke, she could not say whether the dream had comforted her or frightened her, and she did not tell Yora because he would make it into a practical worry, and she did not want it handled. They left on a morning like the inside of an oyster shell, pale, luminous, barely colored by a sun that could not yet find its strength. The gate mask had frost in the iron, flowered there by breath and darkened where hands had warmed it. Hoarse breath made the air move as if the world itself were alive. Men who were not the sort to pray touched the stone as they went under the gate, not to ask a god for anything, merely to acknowledge a roof that had been kind. The party was not large. Daisy Mormont wore her mail and its weight did not make her bow. Hallis Malin rode because his steadiness traveled as comfortably as his horse did. Two other men of the guard, chosen not for loudness but for the way they dressed their gear, joined. Yora took his position as if he had simply always occupied that space. Jon rode near the wagon, Ghost setting his own pace beside him, sometimes ranging ahead to count the road and sometimes falling back to count the horses' tails. Daenerys sat a small, steady mare whose coat looked like smoke. The mare liked the smell of the brazier, and the dragons liked the mare's calm. The pale and the green had taken to riding in the wagon when the wind was sharp, curling around the heated stones under the furred cap Sansa had sewn, peeking to IR faces out like children in a fort. The black preferred to sit on the bow of the wagon and lord it over emptiness, tail wrapped around the iron strut like a rope, eyes narrowed against the wind. They passed out into country that took no interest in their significance. Birches stood with the patience of white-haired aunties. Patches of ground where hot springs came near the surface steamed like the breath of beds. The road, such as it was where the north is less inclined to roads, wandered, keeping to high ground when it could, skirting bogs that pretended to be solid until a horse put a foot wrong. A hawk shadow came and went, and once a fox watched them from the edge of a copse and did not move save to lick one paw in a leisurely fashion. Daisy told a story of Bear Island in which the punchline was a bear skin refusing to stay on a man who had no right to wear it. Hallis Malin answered with a story of a woman in Frostfinger who could tell whether a man would die in winter by the way he put his gloves on. Yora did not tell stories. He tended to the mare with quiet hands and to the brazier because he had learned that if you occupied your fingers, your mind would be less inclined to turn on you. He spoke to Daenerys sometimes in a voice pitched for her alone, telling her where the road would drop and where the wind would catch. They made their first night's camp in a stand of fir with a trickle of spring-warmed water that ran under ice and then broke free to talk. The men set the tents with the economy of habit. Jon collected fallen branches and judged them with a flint. Ghost ranged and returned, his muzzle carrying the faint sense of mice who had retreated to the seam between snow and earth. Daenerys insisted on tending the brazier, because she would not ask of others what she had to learn to do herself. She lifted the heated stones with the long-handled tongs Luwin had fashioned and laid them in their bed like loaves. The dragons emerged one by one to lie on the furs and blink at the stars with the same disinterest as the stars showed them. When they ate, it was thick porridge with saved sweetness stirred in, and pork crisped until the fat made little size in the pan. Daisy flung a handful of juniper into the water and laughed at the way the smell transformed the air. They sat with their bowls and the cold made their voices clear. "Do they dream?" Jon asked, gesturing with his spoon toward the dragons, who lay like three ideas having a conversation quietly among themselves. "They do," Daenerys said, watching the pale one's small chest lift and fall. "When they sleep, something else looks out of them. They twitch. They make small noises. Sometimes their mouths move as if talking to a thing they rightfully do not trust." Ghost turned his head and looked at the dragons with mild contempt, and then put his chin on his paws and closed his eyes ostentatiously. "And you?" Daisy asked Daenerys. "Do you dream?" "I do," she said, "of rivers and of halls and of rooms with no ceiling that are still rooms." "You are not made of the same cloth as the rest of us," Daisy observed warmly, not as flattery. "That is not an insult. I have always liked a garment with a bit of thread from elsewhere." They slept in order and with two on watch at all times, wood pops carried far in the cold. The first time a fox screamed in the night, Daenerys sat up with her hand on the pale dragon and listened to the silence afterward. In the dark she felt the ground's warmth, and below that, something like a sigh. They reached the ruins at Queen's Crown on the third day, its tower wearing its broken crown like a king who has remembered too late that laughter is a defense. They climbed and looked, because climbing and looking are what we do when a tower asks us to. The land spread away, white and gray and implacable. Smoke rose in the distance where someone else was also doing as the season required. The wind at the top of the tower took speech out of mouths and threw it away, so they were quiet. The pale dragon tried its breath on the old stone and left a trace that looked like frost and felt like nothing. Snow blew through, erasing their footprints as if to remind them they were not important to maps. They stayed the night in the low room where someone long ago had carved initials into the sill. Jon traced them with a gloved finger and thought about hands he had not met. Daisy snored like a woman sure of her own right to do so. Yora woke in the dark and looked at the black shape of the sky through a hole in the roof and thought of a hall in Old Town where the ceiling had been painted with ships. He shook himself free of that memory, which was too southern and too heavy with the scent of a life he had failed to keep. On the morning of the 6th day, they came to a place where the land began to empty itself of trees and swell into the thought of the wall. You do not see it at once. You feel it first as a thickness in the air, a density of cold that lies different on the cheek. Men in the party began to say less without deciding to. The road, such as it was, straightened as if obliged to run directly to the thing rather than casually wandering. They crested a hummock of earth with the lazy pride of men who have used their legs well, and there it was, a line not so much drawn across the world as raised out of it, a paleness that caught the eye and did not let it go. The wall stood like an argument against sense. It made everything near look as if it had been made by a child who had not yet learned that size is a game. Wind ran its palm along the top, and the sound it made came down like a voice singing a single note forever. The dragons went quiet. They watched in a way that was not animal. They calculated. The pale one lifted its head and exhaled a long stream of white that rose and curved and dissipated. For a breath, delicate filigree wrote itself against the wall's face. It looked like writing in a lingua. Men had once read and then had made themselves forget. The green lowered its belly to the warmed stone in the wagon and held there as if bracing for something most creatures did not feel. The black hissed with curiosity, not fear, and looked as if it could map the height with its eyes. Castle Black sat sullen under the wall's shadow, as if embarrassed by its own size in such company. Smoke rose from its chimneys with the purposeful reluctance of the old. Men on the yard moved with the steady economy of those who do not waste steps in winter. When the party rode in the gate, there was interest but no uproar. The black cloaks turned and watched, and in each man's eye was a tallying and an assessment and a filing of a new thing. Jeor Mormont met them in the yard with the unhurried dignity of a man who had spent his youth hurrying and had learned better in age. The knot of men behind him composed themselves quickly when they saw Yora. That was the kind of thing a yard likes, to witness a man meeting another man in the place where they have both made themselves. Jeor's eyes took in his son and then moved on, because he had learned that a single look can make or break a moment and should therefore be chosen with care. Winterfell sends men who can count, he said to Ned's letter, which Hallis Malin handed him with an air of responsibility that made him taller for the moment. He tucked the letter away inside his cloak. He looked at Daenerys and did not blink. And guests who carry their own weather. My hall is poor, but the oath that holds it up is rich enough to share. Come in out of whatever it is that follows you. We bring none of the South's debts, Daenerys said, because she had learned that men of the Watch do not enjoy being dragged into other men's ledgers. Good, Jeor said, his mouth angling into the idea of a smile, just enough to show he remembered how it was done. We have ours, and we keep our own counsel. But we do not throw guests out into the wind for being inconvenient to someone else's song. Yora bowed, more deeply than he would have in Winterfell, and kept his eyes on the packed snow at the Lord Commander's feet. My lord, he said. Ser Yora, Jeor answered, letting the title land like snow that does not melt. My hall will ask you questions without words. You will answer them with how you sit. I have learned to sit, Yora said, and Jeor's mouth made that shape again that might have been the start of forgiveness or might have been the tolerance men in the north find for things that cannot be altered. They were given a long table in the hall where warmth was something men made rather than inherited. The fire here was not the comfortable animal in Winterfell's solar, but a thing fed thoughtlessly and always hungry. The dragons curled near it with a proprietary air. The Watch's hounds did not approach, but neither did they flee. Men brought bowls and bread and slabs of a stew that had achieved its flavor by refusing to be hurried. Benjen Stark came in with his hood thrown back and his hair damp. Jon rose at once and then stopped himself because he had not yet decided if he was a boy or a man. Benjen spared him the decision. He put one hand on the back of Jon's neck and squeezed, a touch that acknowledged both. You've grown, he said with the dry humor of an uncle who had expected it but would not give the lad the satisfaction of hearing surprise. Your letters smelled like steam when they arrived. They were written over warm stone, Jon said, and Benjen laughed in that low way men of the wall laugh when they remember they have bodies that can be warm. Ned had not come. He had not allowed himself the indulgence of climbing just to look and feel small. He had sent his eyes in the form of men he trusted. Hallis delivered Ned's words to Jeor in a brief aside. The compliments to the Watch's endurance, the promise to send grain when carts could move under snow, the request to find out where the missing men had moved their last breaths. Jeor listened and nodded once, as if everything were already in motion. The talk between Jeor and Yora came after the hall had been fed and the men had returned to their beds as if to a conversation with Winter. They stood in the passage where the cold came up through the floor in exactly the way a man's regrets will come up through his boots. Daenerys passed them with Daisy to see to the dragons. She did not linger, because some moments between men grow feral if witnessed. You did not write, Jeor said. No, Yora agreed. You did not ask for the wall's advice when you first thought to behave as if you were made of hotter metal. No, Yora said. I did not think there were words that would make me into the man you would have had me be. You might have allowed me to try, Jeor said, and that was the closest he would come to saying I would have tried to forgive you and instruct you at once. I might have, Yora said, because age had given him a taste for honesty when it did not cost him someone else's dinner. Jeor looked at him, long enough that the cold made itself known to both their skins. You are here now, he said. The wall does not keep lists of men's old sins. It keeps lists of things that move in the trees at night and do not breathe. I do not ask you for your pardon, Yora said, which was true and also not. The child within any man always asks for it. I ask you for your help. There are things moving beyond your wall that may not care for your opinion. There are men, too, who are thinking of walking where sense would keep them close. Gior made a small sound that might have been contempt for men who could not hold their own reins. There always are, he said. We are not short of fools. We are short of daylight. He glanced toward the yard. You came with dragons. I do not know what I think of there being dragons in my yard, but I know what I think of men who stole from me not returning. If your creatures, he chose the word with care, can look farther than our torches, I will not stand on pride. Daenerys stood on the wall that afternoon and let the world below and beyond make its case. The lift that took them up creaked like the bones of a thing that had not expected to be employed so long. The wall's face up close was not smooth. It was like 1,000 winters made into a single surface, each one writing its own lines in a hand no man had taught it. The wind at the top had a voice like the throat of a large animal who has just decided you may approach but not touch. She pulled her cloak tighter, and the fur lining intercepted the cold with expertise. Benjen stood beside her with his hands on the parapet, and his eyes narrowed the way men's eyes narrow when they are counting distant problems. He did not speak for a time. Men do not feel obliged to fill the sky with words when the sky does not ask. Your brother right stiff, Daenerys said at last, because small talk feels like an insult between strangers made to share a high place. He is a stiff man, Benjen said, not unkindly. Stiffness keeps us from snapping. I am not as stiff as he is. It did not make me better. She looked at him and saw Ned's steadiness bottled and placed on a shelf to be poured out when necessary. Your letter asked for men of sense, she said. I should have asked for women of patience, Benjen said. But men of sense was what the raven could carry. What is beyond your wall? She asked, looking out. Everything that does not accept our names for it, Benjen answered. Snow and more snow, forests that have forgotten our own, rivers that flow in silence because no one has taught them to sing for us, things that move without heat. He caught himself and shook his head. I have not seen those. I have seen shadows move where shadows do not go. I have seen tracks that do not make sense. I have lost men who had left their foolishness with their mothers. Then we will try again to see, she said. She rested her unbandaged hand on the parapet. The stone was so cold that it felt hot, the way ice can burn. The pale dragon crept along the top with the gleeful carelessness of a creature who has never yet fallen. It stopped and looked over the side and then made a soft sound like a small bell heard through cloth. It exhaled. This time the white breath hung longer. Where it touched the air above the trees, patterns wrote themselves. Delicate fern-like shapes, arcs, angles, like the trace left by a skater on a pond. The shapes held, luminous, and then they were gone. Benjen's hand tightened on the stone. What is that? I do not know, she said. It looks like frost, but where? Perhaps it shows the path of the wind. There is no wind there, Benjen said after a practiced moment. We feel it here and not there. The trees are still there. Either the wind has grown particular or... He stopped, because men of the wall do not set their names on mysteries until they have no choice. The black dragon climbed with unsophisticated determination to the highest point of the parapet and tried its wings. It rose clumsy, fell, rose again, landed with a fronted chirp. Ghost watched with the disdain of a creature for whom the ground had never been a negotiation. Jon came up on the next lift with Daisy and Yora and a man from the watch with a heavy scar over one eye that had done a poor job of cleaving him in two and therefore had made him a person of interest to boys. Jon stepped onto the ice with care and then with the confidence of someone who had decided not to fall. He walked to the edge and looked out and smiled in a way that made him suddenly look very young and very old at once. I thought it would make me feel small, he said softly. It does. But in a way that makes me feel right-sized. That is a good way, Daisy said, squinting into the distance as if to determine whether the horizon intended to behave for them. Gior came later, muffled and grumpy in the way of men whose joints have long arguments with cold and never win. He stood not an arm's length from the pale dragon and did not flinch when it turned and looked up at him and made a small sound that was respectful without being deferent. "You'll not piss on my wall," Gior told it, and the dragon sneezed, which everyone took as assent. That night, there was a thin moon and the kind of clarity the air has when wind has stripped it of its modesty. Daenerys did not sleep long. She woke and found the hall too crowded with men's noises and slipped outside with a cloak and a lantern. Ghost came with her, materializing out of the corner where he had not exactly been. The yard was quiet. Above, the wall glowed with a light that was not light but the way ice thinks about starlight. She walked toward the gate with the lantern shuttered so its brightness would not make her feel as if she had betrayed the dark. She touched the cold wood, the iron studs, the hinge. The pale dragon had followed unnoticed and now sat on the gate's frame, looking outward with eyes that reflected the lantern's slit of glow in a way that made them look like coins with their king's face turned aside. Beyond, the first line of trees stood like a congregation. Every now and again, something small moved, an animal resolving itself from shadow into shadow. In the near silence, she heard a sound she could not at first name. A very faint tapping, perhaps, as if someone far away were walking on thin ice. The sound came and went. She stood very still, and beside her ghost did the same, the two of them making an agreement with the night not to insult it. The pale dragon exhaled. The breath went out and spread, and where it passed, the air briefly populated itself with delicate structures, intricate and sharp, like frost laid on glass and then lifted away. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw a human shape within the tracery, tall, narrow, faceted, its edges not edges but a suggestion of blade. The shape moved not with wind but with the simple arrogant fact of being. It was gone before the eye could make certain of it. She felt no chill. She felt only the press of purpose, as if something in the world had leaned its hand against the door from the other side to see how stout the wood was. The pale dragon made that small bell-like sound again, and she put her hand on its back. "I see you," she said softly, to the shape that was not there and to the creature that was. "I do not know what you are, but I am here." The next day, Gior sent 2 small ranging parties to places where men had last been expected and not been. He did not send Benjen because he had a strange sense of economy. One does not send both the arm and the hand into a hole and then complain when one cannot pull anything back out. He sent men who had come to the wall with more stubbornness than song and men who knew how to boil water without bragging about it. He did not ask the dragons to do tricks for him, but he did look at them with the frank consideration of a man who has cataloged a new tool and is trying to decide what board it cuts. "Take them to the top again at dusk," he said to Daenerys, as if that were not a request as strange as asking the wind to sit for a portrait. "If nothing else, it will make the men on watch feel as if they have extra eyes." "They are not eyes," Daenerys said. "They are themselves." "Good," Gior said. "Eyes do their duty. Themselves do what they must." Benjen found Jon near the yard's practice ring where a post had been planted and had suffered daily indignities. He stood with a practice sword in hand and made slow, precise cuts as if disagreeing with the post in principle rather than in passion. Benjen watched for a while and then stepped in without inviting himself, taking a second sword and falling into rhythm. They moved with the kind of conversation of movements that men have when they have nothing to prove and everything to learn. Finally, Benjen said, "Do not ask me to argue with your father for what you want." "I wasn't going to," Jon said, which was only half a lie. "I came to visit. I will return." "You will," Benjen said, "and you will use the time between to make yourself into a man who can keep a long oath without it souring in his mouth." "Will it?" Jon asked, surprising himself with the question and then being glad of it. "Sometimes," Benjen said. "Often. Oaths taste different in summer than in winter. But there is satisfaction even in sour bread when one is hungry. And the wall has a way of stripping men to what matters. If you are not careful, you will find that you like it." He looked at his nephew. "Your face belongs in the north," he said, as if that were a diagnosis. Jon touched the side of his jaw and laughed a little. "It is too stubborn to leave. Back in Winterfell, The days settled into a rhythm in which Catelyn found both refuge and the burr of irritation. With Ned's men gone north and riders sent west and east to answer smaller obligations that had arisen, the keep was more hers. She walked the stores again and found she had not miscounted. She oversaw the repair of a stair whose lip had broken under a careless heel. She sat with Sansa and let the girl talk about the way a seam has a sound different from the rest of the cloth when it is going to split. She watched Arya slip out of the lessons Septa Mordain had laid out for her and followed her quietly to the yard where Daisy Mormont, of all the gods' humor, stood with a spear. "You hold it here," Daisy said, juggling it as if it were a stick and not a length of ash that could take a man's life and rearrange his story. "You do not clench. Clenching is for men who want to pretend they have opinions. We have work. Here." Arya took the spear as if it had been a secret long kept from her. She learned that the spear likes to do its work with the whole body, not just the arm. She learned that stepping small doesn't mean stepping weak. Daisy smacked the back of her ankle once with the butt to make a point and then laughed with Arya when the girl spun and tried to smack her back and nearly fell. "You'll be a thorn in someone's foot," Daisy predicted fondly. "A good thorn, one that makes a man stop walking where he should not." Catelyn watched without announcing herself and then stepped away because she had not yet decided what to say. She did not intend to breed a soldier. She intended to breed a woman who would not be killed by being a woman. She went to the Godswood instead and sat under the bough she knew best and listened. The low hum in the stone was clearer there. She put her hand on the ground and felt, not words, presence. Something like the feeling of a child leaning against her calf and then quickly away when embarrassed to be caught. Maester Luwin took to visiting the Godswood with parchment and charcoal. He made notes not because he thought he could command the thing into proof, but because note-making is how a learned man admits that he is out of his depth and chooses not to drown. He held his hand over the pool until his skin wrinkled from steam. He laid eggshell chips near warm stones and watched to see whether they warmed or cooled and wrote neither in the margin and then, under it, both, and under that, how to describe. He began to keep a little ledger of the dragon's food and breath and noises when they were left alone, and when they were attended and noticed that the pale one seemed to prefer to breathe its white only when someone watched. He crossed that out. He wrote, "Or, because it is being watched, we notice it." He crossed that out too. Later, he would admit in the privacy of his own mind that some things cannot be pinned to parchment, and that would both delight and frustrate him. Old Nan smiled to herself as she shuffled about her quarters. Every now and then she would stand very still and look at the stone floor with sharp eyes and say aloud to no one, "There, you are," as if addressing a mouse. Then she would nod once and continue about her business. The ravens in the rookery took to speaking more at odd hours. There is no poetry in saying that birds are affected by things you cannot see. It is simply true. One of the blackbirds learned to make a small click with its beak, like a tap on glass, and would do it sometimes at dawn. The white raven, having delivered its solemnity, grew bored and preened itself and let the gray birds scold it. On the fourth night at the wall, Daisy woke Daenerys with a hand on her shoulder that knew how to rouse without alarming. "Men returning," she said in a voice that kept respect for sleeping men while insisting on action. "From the east line." They went out into the yard pulling cloaks over sleep and breathed air that made nostrils smart. The ranging party came through the gate as if the gate had been relieved to see them. Snow clung to the men's hair and hung from the edges of their cloaks. The man with the scar returned. His jaw set and his left hand held sometimes close to his chest as if it had been insulted and had yet to forgive. Another man came behind with that particular way of walking that means a person has spent time holding weight they wanted to relieve someone else of. On the sledge they pulled between them lay a shape under a tarpaulin. Gior came from the hall without his cloak, which said more about his concern than any speech would have. 3 returned, he said softly, head counting though his eyes had already told him there should have been more. He nodded to the sledge and then to the men's faces. "Alive, warmed enough," the scarred man said. His voice had the rough plate scrape of wind. "But wrong." They took the sledge to the long shed near the gate where the cold could be controlled a little. The man on it, Jon knew him as Craig Toller, a reacher with a farmer's wrists and a quietness that had made some call him dull and others call him steady, lay with his eyes shut. His skin had the color of wax that has been too near heat and then pulled away. His lips were pale, so pale they almost vanished. The smell that rose from him was not rot and not clean. It was the smell of ground when iron has been lifted from it and the neat cut left behind. He walked, the man with the scar said, answering Gior's unwilling question. And then he did not walk, and then he walked again without speaking. He did not look at us. He looked past us. He did not answer his name loudly even when we shouted it, not even when we shook him. Gior's hands closed into fists at his sides and opened. "We'll warm him," he said. "We'll warm him, and then we'll ask him things that belong to the living." "We warmed him," the scarred man said. And there was something like apology in his voice and something like a child asking to be told it had not done wrong. "We warmed him, and he did not. He did not behave like a man who had been warmed." He looked at Daenerys then and at the dragons, and for once he did not disguise the belief that these creatures were now tied to some of the questions he could not formulate. Gior turned to Daenerys. "I do not know what I am asking," he said to her with the plainness he had learned to trust. "But I am asking it." She nodded. She went to the sledge and looked down at Craig Toller and saw a man whose life had been mostly quiet, before the long quiet that is not life. She put her bandaged hand over his chest, careful, not touching, as if she were asking permission. The pale dragon climbed onto the edge of the sledge and lowered its head and looked into the man's face the way a child will look at a sleeping dog seeking the breath that proves it will not bite on waking. Daenerys exhaled softly as if to teach the pale dragon something, or as if learning herself. The dragon exhaled too. The white of its breath spread like fine silk and lay a film over the man's chest. Some of the onlookers shivered instinctively, though the air did not grow colder. Where the breath settled, a pattern emerged, faint, as if etched on glass. A confusion of lines, arcs, small points like stars where no sky belonged. Jon stood very still, Ghost pressed against his leg without moving. Daisy held the torch at a distance so that the light revealed but did not insult. Jorah watched and kept his hand near his sword because he had learned that men who do not understand what they are seeing often find safety in touching iron. A noise came from Craig's throat, not a living sound and yet not purely the imitation of one. Gior leaned in, all his old injuries forgotten, and said the man's name in a voice that had comforted boys and frightened men. "Craig, you've a mother who gave you that name. Listen to it, Craig." The man's eyes opened. They were the color of water seen through snow. He looked at nothing and then at the pale dragon and then at Daenerys and then at Gior. He did not move when Gior's hand touched his shoulder. "What did you see?" Gior asked gently, and there was room in the tone to say you are allowed to have seen nothing and still be alive. Craig's voice was a winter wind's scrape along the edge of a door. "Quiet," he said, in a tone like childhood. Then, after a time, "Blue." Daenerys closed her eyes for a breath, not because she feared what she had done, but because the language of winter had touched her skin and had recognized her. The pale dragon lifted its head and made that bell sound. They warmed Craig Toller with goat skins and broth and the kind of talk men bring out when they have run out of other tools. He began to look like a man who could sleep and wake without needing an argument to keep himself in the world. Gior thanked Daenerys without flourishes and without false intimacy. She nodded and said nothing, because all her words were busy listening to the new grammar the air had given her. Jon found Benjen on the wall again a day later, both of them finding excuses to stand there in silence.
"Sir."
The pale dragon rose and fell in brief jumps that looked like a child with a new toy that might work if shaken. Jon put his gloved hands flat on the ice and felt the cold through them as a theory. "I thought dragons breathed fire," he said, without any accusation, only wonder. "Perhaps they breathe what the world requires," Benjen said. "Perhaps some learn to burn air, and some learn to write with it." Jon nodded. He looked at Ghost, who had his face turned outward as if the evening had an argument and he was waiting his turn to speak. "He sees something," Jon said. "We all do," Benjen answered. "We will not agree what it is, and yet we will act as if we had." At Winterfell, days grew shorter and Catelyn lit candles earlier. She welcomed to table the small men from small holdings who came to speak about fence lines and wolves in sheep pens, and whether the stream that marked a border had shifted enough in last spring's flood to make a neighbor impertinent. She did not say yes to everything, and men respected that more than they would have respected a kind woman whose kindness ruined their accounts. She sent a basket to a widow whose boy had taken a spear for House Stark at the Green Fork of the White Knife 3 years ago and had not brought his spear home. She turned away a man who came to her with a complaint about a woman who had refused him and told him in such short clauses that he understood that he would not receive sympathy in this hall for being refused anywhere. Sansa finished the brazier cap and made a second one and then a smaller one for when the dragons would not share. She showed them to Daenerys when they returned, shy of having made a thing that mattered to someone whose hair turned men's voices quiet. Daenerys took the work in her hands, reversible seams neat as a thought, and traced the stitches with a bandaged finger. "Thank you," she said to the girl in a way that made the words earn their keep. "This will keep them warm." The stitches look like the footprints of a mouse that knows where it is going. Sansa's cheeks went that soft apple color again. She laughed as if she had been given a compliment and a small truth she could carry into the rest of her life. Arya came up behind and jabbed at the cap with a finger. "I could make one with straps so you could tie it to your shoulders and carry the brazier with you while you walk," she announced. "You would look like a snail with a furnace on its back." "Perhaps not with fire," Daisy said thoughtfully, "but a pack that carries warmth is not a mad idea. Men freeze when they rest, not when they move. If a woman could move with heat, she would live where a man would decide to sit and die." Arya beamed, seeing in Daisy a map of herself that had a different coastline than the one Septa Mordain drew. At the Godswood Pool, Bran put his hand on the stone warmed by springs and closed his eyes and saw, for an instant that was less than a blink and longer than a winter, a shadow moving under water that was not water and not shadow. He did not tell Luwin, because boys learn quickly what not to say out loud in rooms where men have learned too many introductions to the same truth. He told old Nan. She cackled and told him to mind his steps. Jon returned to Winterfell with the party after 10 days of the Wall's company, because Ned had not asked him to join anything except the journey there and the journey back. He came in with the look of a man who had learned a new song and had not yet decided whether to teach it. Ghost went ahead into the yard and was jumped by Shaggy Dog, whose vocabulary did not include decorum. Grey Wind clipped Ghost's ear and then licked it, as if to remind him of the rules. Lady trotted up, gave the small black dragon a look of complicated courtesy, and lay down across Arya's feet because Sansa had stopped a moment to smooth her hair and Lady liked to surprise. Ned listened. He took Jon's report in the solar with Luwin and Catelyn and Daenerys present. Jon described the breath, the shapes, the man on the sledge, Gior's face, Benjen's words. He did not add his own hopes. Catelyn watched him and saw a shape of a man forming, like ice freezing at the edges and pulling toward the center. She felt a fierce tenderness for all boys caught between, and she put it away as a mother does a silver spoon when guests are in the hall. "Gior asks for grain," Jon finished, and Ned nodded. It was easier to decide about grain than about gods. "We will send it," Ned said. "It will mean less for us later, and we will send it anyway. That is what a lord does when a wall asks and he has a roof." Daenerys listened and thought of the gate at Castle Black and the sound she had heard through it. She thought of the pale dragon's breath making writing in the air. She had not named them yet. She had begun to think of them with small private names she did not say aloud. One honest as light on bone, one greedy for friction, one patient in a way that made men misjudge it. Names had weight. She would call them when the moment made itself known. She asked to take the dragons to the crypts, and it surprised Ned that this request did not surprise him. He gave a short nod, and Luwin raised an eyebrow and then went to fetch a lantern and a second one because the first would be enough until it was not. They went down the steps into the earth. The air there moved differently, as if it were being breathed by lungs that did not sit in any chest. The stone underfoot was dry. The carved faces watched with their polite malice. Daenerys walked slowly, the pale dragon on her shoulder for once, the green on the curve of her arm as if it had been carved there and then brought to life by the heat of her skin. the black riding Yora's shoulder like a sharp remark. Ghost came too, which made Jon's hand itch, but Ghost had made his own decisions before and would again. They came to the place where Ned had once brought a sister. He stood a little back, not because he wanted to, but because some griefs are always waiting to taste the air again, and he did not intend to feed them more than their share. Daenerys stood before the stone and did not read the name carved there aloud, because she did not need to teach herself this word. She let the pale dragon exhale. The white breath lay on the stone, and for an instant the carved features seemed to shiver with a different life. Not a grotesque one, but the simple courtesy of a face admitting it had once moved. The breath wrote that delicate tracery across the sword the statue held. It lasted longer here, a lace laid down and not stolen at once by the hunger in the air. Ned's mouth tightened. Catelyn watched, ready to take his hand or Jon's or no one's, as required. Luwin leaned forward and then pulled himself back by his own collar, which was a trick men of thought learn, like a dog taught to heel by his own leash. Daenerys put her unbandaged hand against the stone near where a human shoulder would have been. "You were kind," she said, almost a whisper. "A kind woman would have liked you." The black dragon made a small sound, an impatient one, as if to say that time and names are poor betting. The green flicked its tongue out and touched the air twice, as if taking the measure of something too old to disturb. On the way back up, Daenerys touched the wall once, fingers spread, and felt the low hum again, clearer, like a drum played behind a door. The pale dragon tilted its head and then turned it around and looked down the hall where they had not gone and exhaled a small thread. It drifted and dissolved. Luwin saw it and shut his eyes and smiled despite himself, because he had begun to love, even when it frustrated him, not knowing. Snow came heavy the next week, a thick, steady fall that did not ask for drama, only attention. The keep moved within it like a fish in a tank, visible and enclosed. The dragons took to the roof lines and clung to chimneys like stubborn ornaments. The pale one exhaled and watched its breath get caught by gusts and then return to nothing, smiling in whatever way such a creature's face can. The black learned to hop from parapet to parapet, tail held like a rope he could climb back up if he fell. The green slept on the mantle in the solar like a cat and pretended not to be pleased when Daenerys' hand found the spot along its spine that made it hum without sound. Letters arrived and were sent. Lord Wyman wrote with flourishes and suggested, with all courtesy and none at all, that White Harbor's ships could carry north what wagons could not, given sufficient coin and a promise on one knee. Lady Meage Mormont sent a note that was not a note but a piece of bark with a few words cut into it with a knife that said, "Be sensible or be skinned," and Daisy laughed and put it in her belt as a charm. A Karstark wrote in a hand that looked like a man's boots in mud and offered men whose names sounded like winter itself. The South did not write, which was the most ominous courtesy of all. In the yard one afternoon, Theon made a jest about fire-breathing geese, and Arya stole a goose-feather arrow shaft and shot him in the backside with such accuracy that even Theon had to laugh while pretending to be offended. Sansa scolded and then laughed, and then said she was not laughing, and then laughed again when Theon bowed to her with exaggerated gravity and said, "My lady, you have my goose." Daisy taught Arya how to plant her feet and turn without seeing, so that the spear came back to the same place with the satisfaction of returning to bed. Hallis Mullen played tiles with Bran and discovered that the boy had learned to count the distribution without looking at his hand, which made Hallis proud and uneasy both. At night, Daenerys walked sometimes with Catelyn along the covered way above the inner yard. They did not always speak. When they did, it was of practical things in the tone of women who have both known men to die. "How did you know they would hatch?" Catelyn asked once, not to trap, only to learn. "I did not," Daenerys said. "I hoped as if I were drowning and the shore had a name I had forgotten. I made a fire and asked it because sometimes the world wants to be asked." Catelyn nodded. "And sometimes it doesn't." "Sometimes," Daenerys said, smiling. "But even then, it sometimes answers." They paused to watch the yard. The pale dragon chased its own breath in a slow circle, making writing in the air and then erasing it by moving through it. Catelyn thought of the years she had lived and the children she had lifted and set down, and of the oaths spoken around her and above her, and of the way the North took a promise and let it grow like moss on stone. She felt a disloyal impulse to like this woman with the pale hair, and she did not fight it as hard as she might have. "You will have to choose," Caitlin said softly, a sentence spoken the way one tells the weather to a stranger who is not a stranger, "between being safe and being right." "I have been asked that before," Daenerys said. "I chose wrong once. I will try to choose more carefully." Caitlin looked at her and saw a young woman and an old one occupying the same skin. "Try," she said, "and when you fail, forgive yourself. Then try again." In the night after the third heavy snow, a sound came through the keep like the memory of thunder. It was low and rolled. It shook powdered ice loose from a ledge and sent it down in a soft cascade like spilled sugar. Men started and looked at one another and said nothing. Maester Luwin went to the vent where he had first put his hand and found it warmer than it had been. He laid his cheek against the stone and closed his eyes and did not feel a fool. He had given up that vanity somewhere between reading and seeing. Beneath the keep, something turned again, as if deciding whether to rise. News came from the east of men on the shore at Hardhome vanishing, but news from the east is always like that, late and unspecific and exhausted. Gior wrote again, a short letter that confessed nothing and told everything by what it did not say. Benjen's hand appeared in a second note that read, in a line so bare it could have been carved, "Out again. Be back when back." Jon showed it to Ned and pretended to be annoyed by the brevity. But in the night, asleep, he crawled toward the heat of the brazier as if trying to follow the words. The dragons had begun to grow, not so much in length, though their tails reached farther between lamps now, but in themselves, as if the idea of them had become heavier. The black learned to fly from the back of the chair to the top of the armoire and would stand there lordly, wings spread just enough to keep its balance, looking down on the room as if it had invented furniture. The green used its wings to turn and to break, not to fly. The pale one flew only when it chose, which was rarely, and then with a grace so unexpected that everyone went briefly quiet, as we do when the world reminds us that beauty is not ours. Daenerys began to teach them. She did not speak in the old tongue all the time. She used words the way one uses a reed to draw shapes in sand and see whether the water takes them or erases them. She found 3 sounds to which each dragon turned more readily than to others. She found a whistle that drew them down from a high place and a slap on the thigh that meant come and a gentle exhale they seemed to appreciate as manners. She did not command them to perform. She gave them words to move toward and looked pleased when they did. Theon watched and said something snide that made Arya glare and Sansa sigh and Daisy roll her eyes and Caitlin purse her lips. Then he shut his mouth and watched with the kind of genuine attention he had never allowed himself to display, not because he did not have it, but because he had mistaken attention for weakness. Daenerys pretended not to notice, and then one day put the black dragon on his shoulder with a "Hold!" Theon stood very straight. He did not move. He did not fool around. The black dragon wrapped its tail around his neck and hummed without sound. After that, Theon made fewer jests, which improved him. A raven came from White Harbor with a second letter under the first, its seal pressed with a delicate imprint of a fish. It was from a Lysine shipmaster paying court to Wyman, talking of rumors on the narrow sea of ships flying black sails with a red hand on them, and a man who called himself the son of a king hiring acrobats with knives for his table and asking questions about dragons as if they were iron suit coats one could order from a smith. The letter was long and fond of its own adjectives. Luwin read it twice and gave it to Ned. Ned read it once and thought to himself that the South was always inventing sons who could inherit other men's crowns. He leaned back and looked at the ceiling, which did not change. At the wall, Gior's men found a tree with old blood on it and a glove embedded in the trunk as if the tree had decided the hand inside insulted it. They found 2 bodies in a drift, curled together as if sleep were a thing that might forgive them for trying to steal it. They found no sign of Benjen, which was not unusual and yet pained the men who loved him like a stone in a boot that will not shake loose. When the party from the wall came again to Winterfell to bring Gior's letter and to carry back grain, Jon attached himself to them and brought news and brought back the kind of silence a man sets in the room before speaking of hard things. He sat with the dragons and looked at his fingers as if they were a script he might someday have to read aloud without mastering. Robb listened to Jon's stories and then punched him in the shoulder lightly and then did it again. The second time, Jon laughed and gave it back in equal measure. The house breathed easier for a time. Snow continued. The yard reduced to paths that a child could walk while holding their breath. The godswood became a temple in a way even a southerner could understand. The heart tree's face collected snow in its carved eyebrows and looked perpetually skeptical. The pool steamed on and on, proof that water can be warm and uninviting at once. Catelyn put her hand to her belly one morning and felt a cramp that did not belong to any child but to the season. She took willow bark and did not complain. Sansa pricked her finger and did not cry and dabbed the blood on the heartwood of her work table, as if to sign her effort the honest way. Arya split her lip on a spear and sat with it stubbornly to learn not to do that again. Bran found a way to throw snow in such a way that it always slid down Theon's collar. Rickon coaxed Shaggy Dog into dragging him across the yard on a hooded cloak and shouted in triumph when he stopped before the gate with an inch of snow between his head and the timber. Daenerys stood often with Ned by a window or a wall and did not force conversation. His silence was a comfort to her. Men of the free cities had always spoken too quickly, their words spilling like coin, and they had made her into a person who had to step carefully among them to avoid being purchased by accident. Ned stood, counted snowflakes, held small truths in his palm like sparrows, and closed his hand gently before they flew. When she did speak to him, it was mostly to ask about the names of things she did not know. He told her the words for particular snows and particular winds, and for that moment at the end of day when the light makes the top of a wall look like it is thinking. He did not tell her the word he had once attached to a blue flower. He kept that old perfume corked. Once, in the kitchen, Daenerys rolled dough with the heel of her hand under the watch of a woman whose apron could stand on its own. The kitchen smelled of onions and fat and the kind of spice that has learned to travel north and not mac. Ye fuss about it. The woman looked at the dragons without fear and without interest beyond whether they would burn the pies. Don't let it sit, she told Daenerys, meaning the dough. If you wait too long, it forgets what it was asked to be. Daenerys smiled and pressed harder and thought about waiting and about what dough can be taught by a hand that loves it enough to bruise it. Letters stacked. The night pressed its ears to the walls. Under the keep, the low sound in the stone grew and then receded, like a tide that has traveled far to test a door and then retreated to consider its next approach. The dragons grew. Men watched the sky and grew used to saying the word winter again in a way that did not feel like a story meant to frighten children into finishing their chores. And in the cold, in the trees beyond the wall, in the place where men's maps end, something arranged itself. Not a plan exactly, posture, a way of standing in the world that suggests doors rather than walls. The wind did not make that arrangement. It only announced it. The snow did not hide it. It only found its edges by laying itself down. The birds did not sing of it. Their silence served as a song. Back in Winterfell, in the godswood where the springs never forgot, the pale dragon exhaled and a string of white stitched itself for a brief instant from heart tree to roof edge and vanished, leaving on Winter's lips the taste of iron and of a promise not yet spoken.